Hey beautiful people of the internet, my name is Ryan and this Short Story Saturday video is going to be on The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. The Yellow Wallpaper is a classic short story, one that I have read for class I think probably 3 or 4 times, and I am going to put a link to it down in the description below in case you haven't already read it. You can go do that, because this video is going to contain some spoilers. Are we catching on about the Short Story Saturday thing? I still want to say that disclaimer at the beginning of every video, just in case someone doesn't know and they don't want the story spoiled for them, but by now you guys know the deal. Okay, The Yellow Wallpaper, first published in 1892 by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I think that makes this the oldest short story that we have read so far. The Yellow Wallpaper is the first-person account of a female narrator who goes to spend her summer in this big old mansion because of some health problems. She has a husband whose name is John. John is pretty distant and not always at the mansion, but he's also pretty assertive and dominant, and he kind of gets his way in life in general, and specifically in his relationship with his wife. There's also mention of a baby, aka the female narrator has given birth not long before this story, but the baby is off being taken care of by another woman while the female narrator gets to spend some time in this house working on her health. If you are picking up on the way that I am cringing and talking about the female narrator's health, that is for good reason. You see, because what's happened here is that we start the story hearing that the narrator is sick, and we believe her for good reason, you know? She has no reason to lie to us about her being sick. But the problem is that over the course of the story, we start to get some dissenting opinions about exactly what is happening to this narrator. On the very first page of the story, the narrator tells us something which doesn't seem like too big of a deal at the time, which is that John, the husband, is a physician, and perhaps, I would not say it to a living soul, of course, but this is dead paper, aka a journal, and a great relief to my mind. Perhaps that is one reason I do not get well faster. You see, he does not believe I am sick. She goes on to say that her brother is also a physician and also of the same opinion. The Yellow Wallpaper then is the story of this sickness and the treatment that happens in this old mansion while the narrator is mostly alone and she journals about her experiences. The narrator really has nothing else to do other than lay in bed and write these notes to us through this journal. And the problem with that is that she's not even technically supposed to be writing. Writing would be a form of stimulation, of kind of exercise of the brain, and the treatment that the narrator is being put through is one of complete lack of stimulation. The Yellow Wallpaper is indeed a story of understimulation. The narrator lays in bed, she knows that she's not well, and she stares at the yellow wallpaper on the room that she's in. Okay, so back up. This story is heavily autobiographical, and it's also beyond autobiographical, pretty representative of the time period, and specifically of how women and their kind of like nervous conditions were treated at the time. In the 125 years since this story was published, thank God, we have made a lot of advances in terms of how you treat these kinds of conditions. So now, with a century and a quarter's worth of hindsight, we know that this is a pretty medieval treatment, a pretty crude one. But, and I'm gonna repeat this just for effect, at the time this was considered normal. So Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a woman who was actually put through this treatment and suffered nervous breakdowns because of it, she sets out to write a story that critiques how this seems logical in any way. As the story continues, the narrator becomes obsessed with this yellow wallpaper, and specifically obsessed with a woman that she can see who is behind the yellow wallpaper, trapped in the walls. It's pretty obvious that she's losing it, but what she's doing is she's running around the walls, taking the wallpaper down, trying to let the woman out. In fact, in the last page, there's this description of the narrator's shoulder rubbing against the outside of the wall as she runs in circles. She's talking about why she wants to stay in this room. But here I can creep smoothly on the floor, and my shoulder just fits in this long smooch around the wall so that I cannot lose my way. This is obviously an unreliable narrator. We're kind of watching her lose her mind as the story progresses. But what happens at the end is that John comes into the room. That's right, John, the physician, the very person who has trapped her in this room because of his will, who at the beginning of the story, the narrator writes, "If a physician of high standing and one's own husband assures friends and relatives that there is really nothing the matter with one but temporary nervous depression, a slight hysterical tendency, what is one to do?" It's pretty obvious from the first page that John is using his status as a husband and as a physician and as a purveyor of some shoddy science to lock his wife in this mansion, aka mental institution, I mean mansion, up in a secluded room where she's left with no one but herself to hurt because of this nervous breakdown. And so we get to the last page of the story, when John walks in, when the lady who has been behind the wallpaper has been supposedly let out. And John says something to the narrator, and what she responds with is, quote unquote, "I've got out at last," said I, "in spite of you and Jane. And I've pulled off most of the paper, so you can't put me back." Now why should that man have fainted? But he did, and right across my path by the wall, so that I had to creep over him every time. In case you missed it, what happens there at the very end is a switch of point of view, supposedly from Jane, the female narrator, the wife, to the point of view of the crazy woman who has been locked behind the yellow wallpaper. It's a really kind of beautiful switch of point of view right at the end there, but that's not what I want to talk about today. What I want to talk about is the fact that I have graded probably 80 papers on this short story, and most of those papers center on one question. Is this a story of liberation or not? Is this a victory for the female narrator, or is it a loss? Of those 80 papers, I feel that I've read almost every argument about whether or not this story is a story of feminist liberation. And I actually still don't know which side of that debate that I fall onto, but I don't think that that's the reason that we're still reading this story 125 years after it was published. I think that if the yellow wallpaper were a clear story of victory or a clear story of defeat, then we would not still be reading it. And that is what I think is special about this story. I think that Charlotte Perkins Gilman knew something about this kind of situation that we don't give her credit for. And that is that if she were to try and write this story as a victory or as a defeat, that would be a little too simplistic. That would be a little reductionist of the massive complexity that is this situation. I think that if the female narrator is victorious over John, or if John is victorious over her, or if mental illness is victorious over either of them, whichever of those cases, I think that if that happens, it's simplistic and it reduces the truth of the special bind that women were in this situation back in the day. Being responsible for the birth of an actual new human, and also being exposed to all of the anxieties and different complications that still happen in pregnancies today, while also being married to husbands who have much more of a say in the worlds of science and medicine at the time. So women found themselves between a particularly big rock and an especially hard place, and I think that Charlotte Perkins Gilman knew that when she wrote the story The Yellow Wallpaper. I think she knew that we've got to avoid discussions, simplistic discussions of victory or defeat. I think it's more complex than that. I hope that you had your own visceral response to this story, which I would love to hear about down in the comments below. Thanks for sticking with me in this video. Our next video, our next short story Saturday, is actually going to be on A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I know a lot of you guys have been talking to me about doing more Marquez, and I'm gonna start with this short story. I will also put a link to A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings down in the description below, and I think that's gonna do it for today. I hope that you've enjoyed yourself just as much as I have, and in the meantime, until the next video, best wishes! Hey, beautiful people of the internet, my name is Ryan, and happy Saturday. Happy Short Story Saturday, specifically, because today we're going to talk about Bullet in the Brain by Tobias Wolff. I never saw a worse paper in my life. One of those sprawling, flamboyant patterns committing every artistic sin. It is dull enough to confuse the eye in following, pronounced enough to constantly irritate and provoke study, and when you follow the lame, uncertain curves for a little distance, they suddenly commit suicide, plunge off at outrageous angles, destroy themselves in unheard of contradictions.